Functions are a useful abstraction in JavaScript, but sometimes I need more than just a function. Sometimes I need an object, and that object has data and it has methods attached to it, and that's the type of abstraction that I need. And let me show you what I'm talking about from a client perspective. In other words, as a client, someone who is going to use an object that exposes methods and data, I want to be able to say that I need a worker object, and I can get that worker object by invoking a function called createWorker. Once I have the worker, I want to be able to do things like worker.perform job 1 and worker.perform job 2. And it's really not important what those specific jobs are. Job 1 could be call a web server. Job 2 could be massage the data that came back from the web server. We're not really concerned with those details at this point. What we're really focused on is how do I create this worker object that has two methods on it, job 1 and job 2. There's several ways to do that in JavaScript, but let me show you the common approach that we use with Angular. Right now, I know I need something called createWorker that points to a function, and that function has to return an object that has job 1 and job 2 on it, and they have to be functions that themselves can be invoked. So I know ultimately I need to return an object. This is the JavaScript literal syntax where I can just define an object and I can say, yes, it has something called job 1, and job 1 is a function, and I could just have an inline function defined right here and maybe do a console.log inside of it. But I'm going to take a slightly different approach. Yes, I do want to return something that has a job 1 method on it, but I don't want to define those functions inline. Typically, when I sit down to write an object that's going to expose some sort of API, what I want to do is focus on the implementation details first. So I'm just going to create a variable called task1, and task1 just happens to point to a function that will do a console.log that says we are inside of task1. And since this is a very simple example, let me just copy and paste that code and change this to be a task2 variable. And when that is invoked, it will print out the result task2. And now the question is, how do I return an object that exposes task1 and task2 as methods that can be invoked when someone says worker.job1 or worker.job2? And again, the object literal syntax will let me do that. I can say job1 is a member of this object. And instead of defining an inline function here, I can say that job1 points to task1 and job2 points to task2. And now that will return the proper object, an object that has a job1 method and a job2 method, and the code I have below should work. I could also call these variables job1 and job2. In fact, most people will do that to avoid some confusion. Then the object that I return here, this line would be job1 colon job1, because that variable would be named job1. And below that we would have job2 colon job2. But this is just an example of how you can alias things. So I think of the top part here as my private implementation details. I can call these functions whatever I want. I can even have private functions that aren't exposed from this object. But when I return this object, I'm really defining the public API. I'm saying here's an object that has two methods, job1 and job2. No one really needs to know what is inside. But if we were to come in and clear the console and refresh this page, I'm able to see that I just executed task 1 and task 2. And to many people in JavaScript, if you go out and read about JavaScript patterns, they'll refer to this as the revealing module pattern. It's a module because what we've done is encapsulate some code inside of a function. And a module, the general meaning of that term in computer science and software development in general, is some collection of components or features that you can put together to perform some useful work. So we're creating a module in JavaScript by defining a function. Inside of that function, building up some things that we can use and expose to the outside world, and we can even have some private implementation details. For example, if I create a variable called workCount that counts the number of times that task 1 and task 2 have been invoked, that's not something that I want to expose to the outside world and allow them to manipulate it. It's just something that I want to use as an internal implementation detail, and perhaps each time these methods are invoked, I will increment work count, and I will also print out the current value of work count here inside of each task. So work count plus equals 1, work count here also. So now let's clear the console, and also let's add a couple more calls to job 2, refresh, and you can see how work count is incremented. So I have task 1, we essentially did 1 unit of work, then 2, 3, and 4 units of work. And this is something that we'll do later in the Angular course. We'll be defining a function that returns an object that provides an API for other pieces of code elsewhere in the application to use. And inside of that function that we created, this function like create worker, we can have some private implementation details and properly encapsulate our work so that it's hidden and other people don't have to worry about it. Now, the one drawback to the code that I've been writing so far, both this code and the previous code snippet, is that I'm creating global variables. Let's learn about what those are and how to avoid them next.